Hi, everyone, on this beautiful Utah weird spring winter day. Um, it's good to be here. Welcome to our second session of the day. Our session's not very long, and it'll end before we know it. I'll announce when we have 20 minutes left, if that's okay with you, Eric, before the session is completed. That'll give you, Eric, about 10 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll move on to additional conference business, such as our randomly drawn prizes, the session evaluation, and any questions if we have time to answer them. I'd like to introduce our speaker. His name is Eric Tadehara. Did I say it right? I can't hear you, Eric. The good thing we checked that. Yep, there you are.
Perfect. And yes, that was good.
Perfect. Thanks. So Eric Tadehara is an LCSW and MPA, Assistant Director of the Children's Behavioral Health, Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. He works for the Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health as the Assistant Director of Children's Behavioral Health. Thank you for that. He has worked in the field of social work for the past 12 years in roles including direct clinical practice working with children, adolescents, youth in transition, and adults with mental health concerns, substance use concerns, and intellectual disabilities. He's also worked in crisis evaluation and management and behavioral health administration. He received his Bachelor of Social Work from Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, and his Master of Social Work and Master of Public Administration from the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Wow, that is a lot of accomplishment. Thank you so much for what you do. And I just want to say, I'm a parent consultant with Utah Family Voices, which is a project of the Parent Center. And our main focus of our grant is to help families make sure that they have access to healthcare. So this is right up our alley. It's dear to our hearts. And thank you so much for this presentation. I'll now turn the time over to you.
Perfect. So before I share my screen, I just want to say it sounds cooler than it is. It's a lot of schooling. So it's anything that sounds like a great accomplishment is mostly just me not knowing how to stop going to school. Outside of that, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you in a virtual capacity. I wish I could be with you all in person. I prefer to do this stuff in person, and it's a lot easier in that capacity. I will also let you all know, I am not sure what capacity you have been using for asking questions. I don't love the just straight lecture style. Because of that, if there are things that someone wants to ask a question during, feel free. And I'm not sure if that would go to Utah Parent Center staff to kind of filter out through comments, but feel free to interrupt and ask questions throughout. I'd prefer that method than to be stuffy and just talk at you, especially because obviously I can't see anybody's face, and that's also kind of difficult with all this. So anyway, without any further.
Sorry about that. I would
Go
be
ahead.
happy. I'll be happy to ask you those questions as they come in.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, so let me make sure that this is shared correctly. So you should be able to see the actual presentation. Do you see something that says Telehealth 101?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So with that, I won't really do anything regarding introduction, but so I'll just start out. And one of the things that's really important as we're talking about telehealth, I want to talk a little bit about some myths. I think telehealth might have fewer myths today than it has in the past, but I still think there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of concerns, a lot of just misunderstandings for what telehealth is. Telehealth itself has been around for a very, very, very long time. I'll start off by saying that. And telehealth in its original conception was actually just based on communication over the phone. So doctors would be able to utilize a phone call to communicate with an individual, and they'd be able to do things in that capacity. And that was actually considered to be telehealth as far back as the 70s. So it's not in its infancy. However, the iteration that we're in today, I think, is a lot newer and a lot more different than people are, I think, comfortable with, I'll say. So that leads to this first myth. Patients, families, people, they just won't use it. I love telemedicine. I love telehealth. One thing that I will say is that most people tend to love it as well when they start using it. There are a lot of concerns that come up at first, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that, and we'll hopefully talk about ways that we can address that, and you all can address that as parents and family members. Within that, though, we have found that when people start to use telehealth, they tend to be comfortable quickly as they're going through it. And it's something that is kind of a shocker for people. It's a new technology. It's something that's a new form in order to see a provider, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a therapist, whether it's an occupational therapist, it doesn't matter. It comes across as very new and very different. So there's a lot of that hesitation at first. One of the things so I have on here, according to it, and this is a 2015 survey, but I think it's still relevant today, and I think we're actually seeing better results today. But only 16% of patients and clients really would prefer to actually seek care directly face-to-face if they also had the option telemedicine. And that was specifically for emergency room, but we're seeing similar things within our systems as well. Once you get past the initial visit and the initial engagement period, it's a lot more comfortable than people think. I think that is fascinating, and I think it's something to keep in mind as we're trying to be open and flexible with just our world today. The next thing then is security. In our current day and age where I have two cell phones, one is for work, one is for personal use. I'm obviously speaking to all of you via a camera. Many of you, I assume, have a camera in front of you as well, if not a microphone as well. Within all of those things that we have, this concept of security and privacy is always interesting to me. We walk around with multiple cameras and microphones on our person almost every day because most people have access to a cell phone. As a result, the fact that there's this myth that doing telehealth, using healthcare systems on a web-based platform with a camera isn't secure is interesting because we share everything else, whether it's on Facebook or other social media, whether we're sharing it in other capacities, whether it's just the ability to FaceTime someone who we care about. That is all a way that we share things. And most of those are actually less secure, far less secure actually, than something that would be utilized in the healthcare system. So within our healthcare system, we have a lot of requirements as it relates to what has to happen. And this is across the board. This isn't just mental health. This isn't just physical health. It's every type of healthcare has to abide by these rules. And these rules are things as it relates to, I'm sure people maybe heard the term HIPAA, which is just a fancy term for privacy. It's a privacy act for the federal government, basically stating that if I'm a therapist, I can't say that, I saw John Smith and disclose that information and go over all that with people that are public. I also need to have very specific information and data encryption from a technological side. And I won't bore everybody with that because quite frankly, it does get a little boring to talk about those technological details. But just know that there are a lot of things in place to ensure that your information is typically double and triple encrypted. And then in that capacity, it's harder for others to access, except for the people, obviously, who are providing that healthcare and hopefully yourself, because at the end of the day, all of this information, all of this data is yours. And I think that's important to know, even outside of telehealth. And I'm sure you have all been told that numerous times, but I'm going to reiterate it because I think not enough people understand that. When you or your kids or the people you care about are going to the doctor or they're going to see a healthcare provider, anything that happens is your information. That's yours to access. And it's the same with telehealth. And I want to make sure that is very clear because I think we have this misconception that, whatever happened, especially in the virtual world, is something that I don't have access to after, or I can't figure out how to get that information back to me. Anyway, the third myth that I really want to talk to all of you about, it's this idea that there's really no market for telehealth clinicians or for psychiatrists or doctors or other healthcare providers. And when I say market, I mean there's not a competitive way that a provider would actually want to use telehealth. This is a fallacy. It's something that I think, as we've seen over the course of this last year specifically, there is absolutely a market for this. There are people out there who want to provide this service, whether it is mental health or physical health or behavioral health, it doesn't matter. There's an ability and a desire for professionals to want to serve people in this capacity. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about why telehealth is a good thing. But just know there are a lot of provider networks out there, a lot of people who are trying to do this work. And ultimately, there's just a lot of I think, motivation from people, whether it's policymakers and lawmakers, whether it's professionals, whether it's families, whether it's individuals just trying to seek treatment, to have the ability to get this treatment in a capacity that's different and a little bit more accessible than a face-to-face visit. When we are going over these kind of things too, I think it's also important to know that these markets, and I say market, I know it's a little bit technical term, but one of the things that we see a lot of is actually places that are just continuously popping up that are businesses that provide these types of services. I'm sure since most of you have some sort of access to a computer or a cell phone, you have access to an app store of some kind. If you were to look at an app store, you'll find various types of, and I'll just speak from the mental health side, mental health apps that are linking to mental health clinicians or providers. And I think it's a positive that there's more access, but it's still something that it showcases how many people want to use these types of services. So I think that is something that we all need to be very clear about is, yes, I should be able to find someone a lot easier when I'm looking through telehealth. And that actually will lead me a little bit to this idea of flexibility and why telehealth. All right, so the first thing I'll say about telehealth, I've mentioned this a few times. I absolutely love telehealth. Telehealth to me is not the next form of healthcare, but it is part of that iteration, part of that evolution of healthcare. It's something that is a positive in more respects than not. And it's something that at the end of the day should hopefully help with a lot of needs that we as people have just in our everyday lives. Flexibility is a huge thing. And I'll say this, I happen to work a job where, I mean, right now, technically I'm a lot more flexible since I'm obviously sitting in my home. But I work a job that's still mostly 9 to 5, although I work far more than the 9 to 5, unfortunately. I think that a lot of people have work hours that they really can't change. They don't have the ability to say, you know, I work business hours and I need to go see a therapist or I need to go to my doctor and I'm going to take 2 hours off of work or 3 hours off of work. It just doesn't work. So knowing that, having flexibility is such a huge importance because it allows for someone to access service just where they are. The fact that I can schedule an appointment with a doctor and I can just do it from the same room that I'm doing my regular work in is a huge benefit. The fact that you all can do that from the comfort of your homes is a huge benefit. The fact that you can do it without having to drive, whether it's 10 minutes, whether it's an hour, doesn't matter. It's a benefit for you where you have the ability to avoid things that are a little bit more inconvenient. And hopefully it also allows you to just live your life more regularly than having to schedule things around this idea of needing to seek healthcare. I know a lot of people, we've actually seen this in studies and in the utilization of healthcare, but people will avoid using healthcare when it impacts their daily lives. And on an interesting side note that is not directly related to healthcare, but it's related to this concept of seeking services. As humans, one of the things that we find most valuable is actually our time. So if we, as humans, have the ability to gain back a half hour or an hour somewhere, it doesn't matter what it's for, that is a huge benefit for us. And one of the biggest areas that we can gain that half hour back is through the utilization of something like telehealth, where we're not having to travel for 10 minutes, there 10 minutes back, not to mention being early, and then whatever time your actual doctor appointment is. This way you can just have your scheduled appointment. You can be available for that appointment. And once you're done, and you get to go back to doing your regular life. I mentioned comfort, and I love this little picture of this cat. It looks very snuggly, very comfortable. And I think it's just this picture of what healthcare should be. I don't know about anybody else. When it comes to healthcare, most offices, and this is across the board, physical health, behavioral health, it doesn't matter. Most offices are fairly sterile. There might be some flair maybe, or a child's play area or something like that. But for the most part, there's still a level of this rigidity, this sterile nature of an office. And it's something that I think it's not as friendly as it could be. And that's the cool thing about telehealth is by being able to do it in your own home, you have the ability to be somewhere that's comfortable. If I wanted to take a therapy appointment for myself, I could go sit in a very comfortable chair in my living room, and just kind of curl up with my computer and have a place that's safe and a place that's comfortable for me. And the same thing can be said for all of you and all of your kids. And I think the important thing with comfort too is when we're dealing with individuals, whether they're dealing with physical or behavioral healthcare needs, I think it's important to understand that the way that we feel will also help understand where we are at with our healthcare and what we're trying to seek. If you're in an environment where you're not comfortable, there's a really good chance that you're not forthcoming. There's a really good chance that you want to leave. And I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I can speak from anecdotal experience. Whenever I go to the doctor, my heart rate tends to be elevated. My heart rate is never elevated anywhere else, but when I go to the doctor, my heart rate gets elevated, especially when I'm worried about why I'm sick or what's going on. The next thing is direct support. So direct support is really interesting because for direct support, you're really able to do things in a capacity that is for you or your kids, that is hopefully directly to the point. You're not trying to worry about going through X, Y, and Z consultation, an appointment in order just to get to where you need to go. There may still be some of those hoops, but with telehealth, it hopefully alleviates the need to have, this 10-minute appointment here, this 10-minute appointment there, and all of that is coupled by an hour's worth of driving. It's really a huge benefit for the individuals. It brings accessible healthcare to each of us in a capacity that really is something that we should have better control over. And I think that is just a huge thing that we need. And quite frankly, too, especially when we're looking at things. So as we're talking about things like mental health or intellectual disability or things like that, there is such a benefit to have someone be able to show you the environment they're in. So if you're doing work and the person you're doing work with doesn't know what your home looks like, if they don't know how things are set up, there's a really good chance that something they're telling you isn't, or trying to help you with, isn't going to work or benefit you. But by having this camera, you can walk them around with a laptop or a cell phone and showcase certain things and where things are, and really have that open communication a little bit better. By the way, I've noticed there's some comments. I don't know if there's any questions, but feel free to let me know. So don't hesitate to stop me.
Eric, we do have a question from a mom. I had made a comment as well, but you can just read that and the other parents can read it. But there is a question from Consuelo Mendoza, and she says, how can I identify the best plan, what I need to know, and what are the tips that would help me demand the best?
Those are good questions. I actually have a couple slides that are how to really help yourself and your family prepare and what to do when you're talking to your provider. So hopefully that will clear some of that up. And that will be in my next couple slides. But we'll go back to the question, Consuela, if I don't answer it. So feel free to ask again after I go through my next few slides, okay? All right. So I'll just talk about some possible concerns. These are things that I think can be different depending on the type of healthcare you're trying to get through telehealth. I put body language specifically because from a behavioral healthcare perspective, body language is extremely important. On this camera, you can only see a fraction of my body. You can see that I'm sitting in an office chair. When it comes to if I were like laying down or if I were in a comfy chair, you still only get part of the picture of what I'm doing and how I'm interacting. And oftentimes in these situations, the way that people interact is going to be a little bit more focused on what the camera is doing and where the camera is at. So it changes the body language for things. You may not have an example like this kid here who is very angry and crunched up, or you may, but there may be part of the picture we're not able to see. On a behavioral health level, that's extremely important. And I think it's part of that need to make sure we are communicating effectively because a lot, I mean, I won't go into the details, but everybody I'm sure has been told communication is much more than verbal communication. There's a large aspect of nonverbal communication that really represents what is happening. I talk with my hands a lot. It's a huge aspect of that. I try to be very expressive with my face. Those are things that can be seen through camera, but sometimes they're also difficult to be seen through camera. There are also, like I mentioned, areas where it's really easy just to turn this off. If I wanted to turn my camera off right now, you would have no idea what's going on aside from the fact that I'm a voice talking at you. And that's also difficult to understand or to try to figure out what's happening and the best ways to really engage people. It's actually one of the reasons I prefer to do this stuff in person because I don't have the ability to see any of you and I don't know how much you're actually engaged. I don't know how much you're in a sense paying attention or if there's questions or question faces. And that's hard. It's a very difficult thing as we're trying to go through this. And it's something that can ultimately just lead us to have more questions. And I'll tell you all from a professional perspective, one thing that I think is important for professionals is this idea to, I'll use this quote that I really like. It's to be curious. I think the important thing about being curious is the ability to ask questions. And when it comes to something like this, we end up having to ask more questions. And that is okay, because the more questions we ask as professionals, hopefully the better off you are all in accessing whatever service and care you need. Lack of privacy is kind of interesting because I already talked about how secure and private these feeds can be, whether it's through platforms like Zoom or not. When I talk about lack of privacy, though, one of the difficulties here is actually the privacy of your actual physical environment. So think about it in this capacity. You are sitting in your room taking a video with a doctor, with a therapist, with whoever it might be, and then someone just walks in without knocking. And let's say you're talking about something very personal. Let's say you're showcasing something to a doctor that is a little bit harder to see, or maybe you don't want someone to see that. Maybe there's a situation where you don't feel safe where you are, but you want to talk to someone, so that's why you have your door closed and your door locked. But maybe you don't have the ability to actively talk openly because you're not sure who is actually listening. Those are all things that are really interesting when it comes to privacy, and it's something that we really need to be cognizant of and pay attention to when we're working with people, because it changes the dynamic of what's happening. If I don't feel comfortable and I don't think that there's a private element to this, there's a good chance I'm not going to be forthcoming. I'm not going to share what I need to, and chances are it'll end up being, and I don't use this term lightly, but a waste of time for everybody. And mostly for myself as the person who's getting the service. If you're getting the service or your kids are getting the service and there's an issue and there's not that forthcoming nature of what's happening, then at the end of the day, you're just making it so you have to re-go through these things. And sometimes those things can be traumatic. They can be difficult. And when that happens, all you're doing is rehashing these issues over and over again. And it's not a fun thing to have to do. The next thing is tech issues. So I actually will give you some fun examples. So yesterday, I actually, as a side gig, I am an adjunct professor at Weber State University. Through my role at Weber State, I actually have been teaching in this capacity as well, which is a little bit hard as we're talking about all this. It's good to be forthcoming. Yesterday was very interesting because I have a class that I teach through Zoom. And yesterday, my Zoom program on my computer decided to quit working halfway through my class. So I was in the middle of talking and I could still see everybody. And then all of a sudden, everybody said, "We can't hear you. What's happening?" Nothing had changed on my end, but apparently my microphone wasn't working. So with that, I had to do some troubleshooting in the middle of my class, and I ended up having to do the rest of my class from a cell phone, which is not an ideal situation by any means. With healthcare, it could be the exact same, especially because there is not a positive way that we all have the same access to internet, or technology for that matter. And I think that's really important because one thing that we have learned, and I say we royally as a society have learned, is that the internet is an absolute necessity in today's day and age. Utah is beneficial in the fact that out of our urban areas all rank within, I think, the top 15 counties in the country to have internet access, which is great. It's super good. The problem is there are still people who don't have internet access in our urban areas. And then the bigger problem is that if you live somewhere that's not in like the Wasatch Front, it's not in Salt Lake City, it's not in Davis County or Weber County, Ogden area, that's not in any of those major metropolitan places in Utah, there's a good chance that it's going to be harder to get internet access. Or your internet access is limited to X provider and you only have certain access to certain speeds. Unfortunately, having those limited access points also makes it difficult to actually be able to do this effectively. I'm sure many of you have, especially over the past year, have been communicating with friends and family via video. If you're communicating via video and all of a sudden it starts getting choppy, it starts getting difficult to hear, or the sound cuts out, or the video cuts out, or it just gets really jumbly, there's a really good chance you get thrown off. You don't want to continue with the conversation. You want to really just kind of end things. And the same thing can be said for telehealth. It actually also leads to some concerns when it comes to an emergency situation. So, for example, if there was a crisis of some sort and you were accessing an emergency line, or you were trying to do something with an emergency doctor's appointment or something like that, and your internet cuts out, or your cell phone doesn't work, or your laptop dies, or whatever it might be, then the individual who's providing the healthcare has no idea why you hung up. And you have to try to figure out and scramble with what to do next. So it's really important then to have these kind of emergency plans. And I realize I'm kind of being a little long-winded, so I'll kind of speed this up a little bit. So these are, I think, the things that these next two slides are, I think, the things everybody kind of wants to know a little bit more about. So how to help and prepare yourself and your kids. So firstly, let your kids know what to expect. When you're going to do this with your kids, make sure you talk to them and talk to them at their level. Obviously, all of our kids are going to have different levels of communication. They're all going to be able to do things and understand things differently. And hopefully our ability as their parents is an ability to communicate with them effectively and really talk to them about what the needs are for them, why we're doing this, what this is going to look like. But also that leads to this idea of setting boundaries. If you talk to your child and they understand, that you're doing this through a video, and they also understand that if they don't like it, they can ask to stop. That's a really important boundary to have. It's not for everybody, telehealth. And I think that's a misconception that everybody will benefit from telehealth the same way. And that's not true. I wish it was, but I do think that that's why it's important to have these open conversations with us and with our kids and say, if this doesn't work, or if you're not seeing the benefit, or if you don't want to do this, please let me know. And we can figure out an alternative. We can maybe try to figure out a way to get you into an in-person doctor or in-person healthcare. Those boundaries are also outside of that too. So I talked about safety. When we're talking about safety, it's boundaries of like, where are we? What room are we going to be in? Are the doors going to be locked? Who is going to be involved? Is there going to be a set of confidentiality or privacy? Those are all really important boundaries to set. And it's also important as you're doing this stuff to really involve your kids. Obviously, there are things that I think kids may just not be able to understand. So I'm not telling you to, sit down with your kids and talk about what HIPAA is. that's not that important. But it is important to talk to your kids about what they're comfortable with and what they want to accomplish and what will be helpful for them. Because if it's not helpful for them, then it's not going to be helpful at all. The next thing is do a trial run. Trial runs are really helpful. You can do a trial run using different technology. Some doctors, some healthcare providers will actually do a trial run with you. Obviously, that's very much up to the provider, but they will be able to say, hey, we can do this or we can't. But that will also help you to understand what are some of those abilities for that provider. When it comes to the things you can do, though, if you have access to something like Zoom or any kind of video chat software, you can really do a dry run where you have your child and yourself maybe in one room or in one area, and then you have someone else that you trust and are comfortable with communicating with you, and you can figure out what is helpful, what works, what doesn't, and that will probably be one of the biggest benefits in trying to figure out, is this going to work for me and my family? The next thing is just ground rules. And when I talk about ground rules, it's really closely related to having clear boundaries, but ground rules can also be some things related to, expectations. So for example, if you're meeting with a provider and their expectation is they see you all the time, then that means that they have to have, you need to have your camera on, and that's one of those rules. If the provider is a little bit more loose, maybe their only expectation is that they can communicate with you and that that you are having maybe some sort of statement or something to showcase that you're paying attention and that you're participating. Ground rules are going to be important, but those are things that you really need to communicate with your providers about. And also, just being open with your providers and knowing and talking to them about what you expect as well for the ground rules. I think that's also very important. The next thing is stay focused. Staying focused can be really difficult when we're on this kind of platform. For example, it's really easy to be on a video, and especially if you're at a computer, to be on a video and then have the internet up in another tab. Or heaven forbid, you have Netflix up in the next tab, and you're watching Netflix while being on a video. That would be very unhelpful if you're trying to go through this. So it's really important to make sure you are focused and figuring out what needs to happen and having that kind of communication. The other thing about that too is when it comes to being focused, just know what your kids can handle. If you or your kids can only handle half an hour, make sure you know that. Make sure your provider knows that, and set that as a ground rule. Say, we can only meet for a half hour and we have to do it in this capacity. If it means that you have to meet with your kid and the provider for 15 minutes, and then the provider just meets with you for the additional 15 minutes or something along those lines, then that's what it means. But you have to make sure that you know what your kids can handle and what you can handle as well. Obviously, the younger children, I think the bigger difficulty is keeping them engaged for longer periods of time. But I think that's a problem for a lot of people. I sit on these kind of video calls all day long, and granted, they're not healthcare, but I can definitely see when people are paying attention, when people aren't paying attention, when people are not focused. And it's because this can be kind of exhausting to sit on these video calls all day long. So it's just important to know yourself, know your kids, and have those conversations. The next thing is just to say, is to provide support. And when I say provide support, it's really just making sure you're providing support for yourself and for your kid, but also asking for that support and making sure that that's there. So if there's a situation where you just can't handle it, or you need to step out of a room, or where your child is having a hard time, that's okay. You just need to have that communication and have that kind of rule as one of the ground rules of, what do we do in this situation? It's also important too to be open and honest with the people that you trust who are in your maybe immediate support system. And then that way you can let them know, hey, I'm doing this today from 2 to 3. I need to make sure that, we're in my room and nobody else can come in. So please just go watch TV in another room, or go walk the dogs, or whatever it might be, to hopefully help avoid distractions, because that's another type of support that we often forget. And asking for that support is really important as family members and as parents and as providers.
Eric,
The next,
minutes out.
yes. What'd you say?
We're about 20 minutes out right now, so that gives you about 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next part of this is really regarding the engagement of your provider specifically. So I talked a little bit about all of this, but I want to make sure I go a little bit more in detail. So you and your child hopefully know yourselves better than anybody. I am a licensed therapist. One thing that I always told and do tell clients and individuals who are seeking therapy from me is that I am not the expert on you as a person or as on your children as people. You and your children are hopefully the experts on yourselves, and I'm here to help guide through the process. The same thing should be said for all healthcare providers, though. Healthcare providers only get a snapshot of what is going on in your life and why you're seeking therapy or seeking healthcare treatment. When that's the case, they have to rely on what you know. So if there's an issue, whether it's related to intellectual or developmental disability, whether it's related to something like autism, whether it's related to behavioral healthcare in general, those are things that are important for your provider to know. So that way they're aware of what's happening. It's something that I think we take for granted, this idea that, you know, if I go see a healthcare provider, they should be the expert, but they're only the expert on the subject matter. They're not the expert on you. So I think that's really important to have that and to also make sure you're communicating that really effectively with whoever your provider is. The next thing is find out if there are other needs related to technology or the telehealth. And when I say that, the needs can be as simple as making sure that the people on the other side are wearing specific clothing. So, for example, we in my office we work very closely with some things, but we've actually had some communication on accessibility features as it relates to deaf and hard of hearing. When it comes to telehealth, deaf and hard of hearing needs can be really challenging, and it's something that's really difficult, especially when you're trying to get that help, because sometimes even if a platform has closed captioning or something along those lines, it might not catch up to what's happening. It might be very slow. It might not be accurate. And those are things that we just need to take account for and figure out. But also, that's an area where you need to make sure if that's a need, you can communicate that with the provider and say, hi, my child or I or whoever it might be has this issue and we need this kind of accommodation. Healthcare providers want to be there for you. They want to help. So that's not something they're going to shy away from and they're going to tell you no. They want to figure out how to do that, but they just need to know what that need is. The next thing, and I already kind of mentioned this, but it's accessibility features. I won't pretend to be an expert on accessibility features, but I do know that all computer platforms have accessibility features. When it comes to these telehealth providing services, they all are by law required to have accessibility required features. We, as a state level, have had conversations with different platforms about why they do or don't work. And it's because of things like this, where it is the ability to have maybe like a high contrast need or a high contrast on the screen, or it's the ability to have something where it does do closed captioning. Those are things that are really important to know. And they're also helpful when you communicate that once again to your provider. The next thing is really just the same kind of issue, but it's making sure that you ask about specific accommodations. Obviously, when it comes to doing things in your own home, you probably don't need to ask about having a service animal there because you should just be able to have a service animal with you. If you have an issue, though, where there's access pieces where you can't use something the same way other people can, or you can't use technology the same way, make sure they know and see if there's something that they recommend in order to access things a little bit easier. I think that there are a number of resources out there to help with that, but I will say that where a provider might not be the expert, they might be able to point you in the right direction. The next thing is just be involved as a family member, as a parent. Make sure your support systems are involved. If you are able to be more involved, if you are able to be more communicative with your providers, it's going to be better for you in the long run, because the best advocate for you or your child is going to be yourself. It's going to be yourself and your child. They're going to advocate. You guys are going to advocate for what your needs are better than a doctor, better than a therapist. And that's not to say doctors or therapists aren't helping, but it's to say that once again, they're not the experts on you and you are. Make sure you guys have a backup plan for emergencies. And this is especially important with telehealth. If you have an emergency situation happening, it's very valuable to have an idea or an understanding of what to do. So that's to have a plan if your internet goes out. Do you have a backup plan for a phone call? It's if there's an issue with your phone or your audio or your video, or there's just a meltdown happening. What is the backup plan there? How do we communicate? Who do we communicate with? So those are really important things as well, because if you're not in an actual office with somebody, there's a really good chance they can't do as much to help you. They might be able to help you obviously get in touch with resources, but because of the ability for telehealth to be provided literally across the nation, across the world, there are some difficulties there with someone understanding what you need in your specific community. So just be open and understanding and have that communication and set that as a boundary, set that as a rule for this is what we need to do if this happens. And I need your health provider to do that. The next thing, just be open, be communicative with all your providers and just tell them what you guys need. It doesn't matter if there's other special concerns. It doesn't matter if it's things that we've already talked about. Be very, very specific and say, hey, I need to know about this and we need to know about this and this is what we need. Because if you're not telling them, they're not going to know. They're not going to be able to read your thoughts and your mind to figure that out. So I have to stress over and over, it's so vital and important to really know that there are things you can do and should be doing. Just talk though, really, just talk to your providers. Providers want to help and they don't want to be the barrier. So please be open. I'm going to breeze through this last piece because this last piece is just an example of some things that my office has done. So we did a small pilot program with some telemental health services for kids with their schools. We did it in Box Elder, Cache Rich, and Utah counties. We were able to do it with 184 youth over 2 years, and we were helped with 49 different schools. These are just some of the benefits that we saw. Basically, people had improvements in their mental health. They had improvements in their grades, and it was just overall a benefit because people had better access to care. Within that, I will say that there are some obstacles, and these are things that we've talked a little bit about, and I just want to make sure you all know. Telemental health, telehealth in general, isn't just for people who live in rural areas. This is something that can be used and done in an urban area. If you live in the heart of Salt Lake City, you can still access telehealth, and you shouldn't be under the idea that you can't just because of where you live. Obviously, there are some issues in some rural areas where you might not have access to adequate internet, but that's a completely different issue. When it comes to if you can access it based on where you live, it should ultimately be yes, you can. Youth and parent buy-in, it's a little bit of an obstacle, like I mentioned at first, but it's something that in the trial and our pilot, we found that the actual issue went away very quickly. Professional buy-in was actually an issue. And then COVID hit and people were like, oh, telehealth is really helpful because I have to stay at home. So now I can do my work from my home and people are able to access care. COVID-19 has been terrible for people. It's been terrible for life. It's impacted all of us in some capacity. And quite frankly, it's impacted kids probably more so than anybody else because it has completely disrupted every aspect of a child's life. And within that, I think it's just really important to know that telehealth is a really vital and viable method to seek healthcare. I won't go too much into this. Aside from travel is really important. You can save plenty of time, and in rural areas especially, you might be an hour or two from a provider. If you can access telehealth from that provider,
Eric, we lost audio on you.
I think my mic just cut out and I apologize.
It sounds perfect. You're back.
Okay. I was just skipping over some things anyway, so hopefully it wasn't too bad. with some just policies and procedures. These are just things that are learned things that we need to do better at, but it's having better access to standards and procedures, and best practices for how we help kids, for how we help individuals, for how we do specialized healthcare. Making sure that we are doing what we can for privacy, and then really just making sure that people have better access to things, whether it's through insurance, whether it's through internet, whether it's through all of those things. So I'll end it there, and I think I'm right on time.